There's a rather quirky, very enjoyable study of ancient Roman religion, not long published, called A World Full of Gods. This book by the late Keith Hopkins explores the world of ancient Roman religion and asserts that the Romans lived in a world richly populated by the divine. In the ancient Roman world, and here the world of Pompeii, the Roman people, or the inhabitants, let me say, of Pompeii, lived in an environment where the gods were neither distant nor strange. In the late 4th century AD, long after Pompeii was a field, the Christian writer Augustine mocked this crowded heaven of gods, these gods both great and small. And his scorn most particularly was directed at what you might call the little gods, who presided over all of the doings of daily life. Now surely of this work, which is so excellent and so very full of the highest dignity, they dare not ascribe any part to the goddess Cloacina. Now for those of you who don't know much Latin, Cloacina is a nice way of referring to the sewer. Cloacina, in fact, is the goddess of the lavatory pan. Or to Volupia, who has her appellation from voluptuousness, from fleshly delight. Or to Libentina, who has her name from lust. Or to Vaticanus, who presides over the screaming of infants. So there we are. You don't need, in fact, to go to one of those special places which helps your child go to sleep. You just need to crumble some bread, a drop of wine to Libentina, not to Libentina, to Vaticanus, and your baby will sleep. So much for Nagala. Or to Cunina, who resides over their cradles. How is it possible to recount in one part of this book all of the names of the gods or goddesses which they could scarcely comprise in great volumes, distributing among these divinities their peculiar offices about single things? They have not even thought that the charge of their lands should be committed to any one god. So, agriculture, lots of gods. Their farms are entrusted to Rosina. The ridges of the mountains to Eugatinus. Over the downs, they set goddess Colatina. Over the valleys, Wallonia. Nor could they even find one Sigetia so competent that they could commend to her care all their corn crops at once. But so long as their seed corn was under the ground, they would have the goddess Saya set over it. So Saya looked after seed corn in the ground. When it was above the ground and forming straw, they set over it the goddess Sigetia. And when the grain was collected and stored, they set over it the goddess Tutilina, that it might be kept safe. Who would not have thought that the goddess Sigetia sufficed to take care of the standing corn until it had passed from the first green blades to the dry ears? But they set Proserpina over the germinating seeds, over the joints and the knots of stems, the god Nodotus, over the sheaths enfolding the ears, the goddess Voluntia. When the sheaths opened that the spike might shoot forth, it was ascribed to the goddess Patelana. When the stems stood all equal with new ears, because the ancients described this equalizing by the term hostire, it was ascribed to the goddess Hostilina. When the grain was in flower, it was dedicated to the goddess Flora. When full of milk, to the god Lacturnus. When maturing, to the goddess Matuta. When the crop was runcated, that is, it was removed from the soil, to the goddess Runcina. All of these gods, all of these deities, overseeing the simple process of growing a stalk of wheat from seed to ripe ear, and then harvested. Likewise in the home, everyone sets a porter at the door of his house, and because he is a man, he is quite sufficient. But these people have set three gods. Forculus is the god of the doors. Cardia, the goddess of the hinges. And Limentinus, the deity of the threshold. Why couldn't Forculus at the same time look after the hinges and the thresholds? Why do you have to have different gods for each thing? But the Romans did. This world, which Augustine mocks so easily with this shopping list of little gods, is the religious and spiritual world in which the Pompeians moved every day. They were suffused with ordinary piety, so much that for them any alternative, any thought that the world could be different was completely unthinkable. And those atheists, and they thought of them as atheists, who denied the gods and followed alternative traditions, were guilty of undermining the foundations of the community and its prosperity. This is a very different world from ours. A world here in the 21st century in which we consider religion to be a largely private matter, a personal matter, something which is your business and nobody else's. As long as it doesn't break the law, and the law is pretty reasonable about these sorts of things. As long as you are moderate in your religion, I guess. You don't offend people by your vigour or your ardour. It's personal, devoted, and a matter of choice. And we accept that there is a diversity, not merely Catholic and Protestant, which is what passed for diversity 50 years ago, but Christian, non-Christian, Buddhist, Taoist, Muslim, Jew, all kind of muddled together in our community, where we accept that people's religions and believe that people's religions are entirely a matter for them, as long as they don't bother us too much with them. Whereas for the Romans, religion, belief, structure, the nature of the supernatural and the relationship between the natural and the supernatural world were in fact fundamental to the patterns of everyday life. The Roman household, for example, was a focus of daily religion. It was the place in which the gods were most active, although not in great things. They were little gods, doing little things. They were lighting the fire, they were cooking the food, they were making sure it didn't burn. They were looking after the toys and making sure that the kids were content. Every home possessed a shrine of some sort to its domestic deities, the Lares. And here we have a series of figures of Lares. And this, a shrine, what's called a lararium. These shrines might be found, not the lararium, but shrines to different gods, might be found anywhere in the home. In the entrance hall was the lararium, but you might find a little shelf in the bedroom or the dining room with little figurines which represented the spirits of that place. The Lares themselves, the household gods, are best understood as spirits of continuity. Lares presided over such family moments as comings of age and marriages. When a Roman boy became a man, this was symbolised by his first shave. The clippings from this shave were given to the keeping of the family Lares. In the same way, a girl came to womanhood on the night before she was married. On that night, on that evening, her toys and her breastbands were given to the safekeeping of the family Lares, while she herself, on the day of her wedding, transferred her devotion from the lares of her father to the lares of her husband's household. As in any community, these shrines of the lares, these lararia, varied in size and scale according to the size and wealth of the household. One of the great houses of Pompeii is the house of the Vetii, the brothers Vetius, a banking family, merchant family, quite remarkable gentlemen with very interesting taste in wall decoration. But one of the things that they gave us was this lararium here. This is beautifully painted and executed. And we see here a little model temple. The two Doric columns here. Here, of course, the regular pediment. And here we have, and in here we have two lares, one here and one here, on either side of an ancestor spirit, shown in an act of devotion, an act of sacrifice. His head is covered, and when Romans sacrificed to the gods, they covered their heads. And he holds a shallow bowl, what's called a patera. And these symbols indicate that he's making a sacrifice to the gods on either side of him. We also have other images of sacrifice. It might not be clear here, but in the gable, we have this little round object here is another patera, and we have the head of an ox and a sacrificial knife. Likewise, below the images of the lares, we have the image of a snake, and what you can't see very well here because it's not clear on the image is a low and laden altar. These are symbols of household fertility and wealth. And these are aspirations. These are the things that, in a sense, the Vetii are trying to control by representing in this image and then sacrificing to these images. In the same way, the gods were depicted in the household in a variety of ways. Cutlery, bowls, and household decoration. This bronze lamp, which is in the exhibition, it's a lovely bronze lamp, and you'll see it's decorated here with a head of Pan. Very obviously Pan, because you can't mistake those goat horns for anything else. They're not a fancy hairstyle. Pan, of course, is a god of Greek origin, whom we also associate with fertility in a kind of agricultural, rural sense. Pan is a god of the countryside. And fertility is also a common theme in Pompeian wall art. Pompeian frescoes are famous for their quality, which is largely an accident of survival. But not just their quality, but also their quantity. And so many of Pompeian frescoes represent religious themes. This one represents Vesuvius itself. There's Vesuvius before it blew up. And its slopes are covered with vines. And here is the god Dionysus holding what's called a thyrsus. We never quite worked out what a thyrsus is, but it's a symbol of Dionysus. This is obviously Dionysus, not just from the fact that he's holding a thyrsus, but that this strange robe that he's wearing is composed entirely of grapes. Again, we have a snake, another symbol of fertility here, a dove. These religious images are part of the daily wall decoration of the home. So just as we have lamps, we have images. Backus, Dionysus. Bacchus is the Roman name for Dionysus. Bacchus, like many other gods, could also be encountered in the street. And there was no clear distinction between the life of the street and the life of the home. For many people, the ways in which people lived really were kind of shuttling between the two. If, for example, you were not particularly well off, it was unlikely that you had facilities in your room or rooms for preparing food. It was quite likely that you needed to go out into the streets and buy fast food. And there were a number of bars called thermopolia in Pompeii for the very purpose of providing quick, easy, and I presume delicious food for not very much money. As Romans went out in their every day or every evening stroll to pick up a pie or a stuffed cabbage leaf or some soup or something of that nature, they would pass crossroads. Every crossroads had its own law. Every crossroads had its own deity. And these lares of the crossroads we find, therefore, depicted in bars. This is a lovely thermopolium. You can see here, let's go back again. You can see here these, they're called dolia, these big bowls. It's basically a Roman version of a bain-marie, because there would be heating underneath, and the food would be in there. And so these would keep the food bubbling away, and so there'd be various things, barley soup or seafood stew or something of that nature for people to come in and eat. But this bar, this fast food bar, had its own lares. And see, at the heart of that, again, is another act of sacrifice. And not only do we have that central act of sacrifice here, and here it's dropping something, probably some incense there on a little portable altar, but again, the snakes feature. And the snakes are a fairly common feature here, these symbols of fertility. Now, these figures and images are not just habit. They're not empty ritual. People invest these things with meaning. And two constant themes have emerged from the kinds of artefacts that we've looked at so far. The first, fairly clearly, is symbolised by the snake here, or by the pan that we looked at a minute ago, and that is fertility. The second is sacrifice. Sacrifice was the language of ancient religion. The practice was based upon the proposition that the gods would perform a service in return for the gift of a sacrifice. It's a theology of indifference. The Romans, like many polytheists, fundamentally believed that the gods had their own lives. They weren't particularly interested in them, and they had to be made interested in what people did and how people worked. And they had to be made, they had to be induced, they had to be enticed to grant favour. The practice, therefore, of reciprocity. I give so that I might get. And the practice of sacrifice then was there to entice the gods' favour. And it might be as simple as some crumbled bread, or a drop of oil, or some drops of wine. Or it might be something more spectacular, like the great ritual of the sua veterilia, which is the sacrifice of a pig and a sheep and a bullock. This image here from the Temple of Vespasian in Pompeii depicts the sacrifice of a bull. The presiding priest can be identified because he has pulled his toga over his head. Romans traditionally sacrificed, as I said, with their heads covered. And here he is pouring oil or wine onto a portable altar. He is served by assistants who carry the gear necessary for the sacrifice. Two others, these servants here, lead the bull to the altar. One carries the long-handled hammer with which the bull will be stunned before its throat is cut. The Romans did not actually kill an animal while it was conscious. First they knocked it out with a great big hammer, hit on the head just there, and then they cut its throat. And these sacrifices did not just represent a great gift by which the one presenting such animals for slaughter gained some personal benefit. For many Pompeians, it was also their only chance for a serious meat meal. Animals slaughtered for sacrifice were only rarely entirely destroyed. More often, only the inedible bits were actually incinerated for the gods to feast upon the smoke, while the rest was divided up and feasted upon by those present more or less on the spot. Public worship and public cult is a fundamental aspect of religious life in Pompeii. The great temple of Jupiter lies in the heart of the Forum. There it is. And you'll note one of the features of Roman temples, and this is the way you can easily distinguish Roman temples from Greek temples, is that you have to go up steps to get there. Roman temples were always set on a raised podium. That enabled them to do two things. It meant that people always had to go up to the gods. And curiously also, their altars were normally out in front. They weren't in sanctuaries right inside. So everything was public. The acts of sacrifice occurred on a podium in the front of the temple, in front of the sanctuary of the god, not in the sanctuary of the god himself or herself. And the other interesting thing, of course, is that because it's raised up, you could have some quite interesting cellars down there, which is where people kept things for safekeeping. And in Roman legionary camps, the shrine at the heart of the Roman legionary camp, which was on a raised platform, was also the safe for the pay. But here, this is the temple of Jupiter, the place of great public cult, right at the heart of Pompeii, in the middle of the Forum. I've just thrown this one in as well. This lovely image of Venus is another image that we find in this exhibition. And it's an exquisite copy of a Hellenistic original in which Venus quite famously is taking off a sandal. She was a very popular goddess, not just because of what she represented, all that physical fun, but also because she had a particular relationship with the ruling house of the Julio-Claudians up until the death of Nero in 68. Elsewhere in the town, and not too far distant, we can find other temples. We can find a temple to Apollo, which is the temple on the image with which I began the lecture. There's a temple to Minerva in an interesting and very ancient part of Pompeii called the Triangular Forum. There's a temple to the fortune of Augustus. Now, the temple to the fortune of Augustus is this one here. A very important temple. It's the temple of the imperial cult. And temples of the imperial cult might be found all around the empire. As already noted, this particular altar here belonged to the temple of the Emperor Vespasian, which was still being built at the time of the eruption in 79. Vespasian was the emperor most recently dead, father of the regnant emperor at the time of the eruption, Titus. Now, emperor worship should not be thought of as the consequence of unbalanced megalomania. Rather, we need to understand it as a display of civic loyalty in a community where the gods were so close to daily life that it was not unreasonable to believe that one dwelt in the body of the emperor. Elsewhere we find images of what's called the genius, the spirit of the emperor. Moreover, in a diverse empire with a multitude of local cults, variant beliefs, emperor worship served as a unifying factor. Even those who worshipped different gods at home or even in the marketplace could join together in common devotion to the emperor. So emperor worship was a great act of civic loyalty. It was also a great act of civic unity. And in Pompeii, this was not an unimportant thing. We kind of think of Pompeii as a Roman town. We talk about Pompeii unselfconsciously as a Roman town, life in a Roman town. What was life like in a Roman town? Let's look at Pompeii. But what kind of Roman town was it? As Roman towns go, it wasn't that Roman. It was a holiday resort town. It was a holiday resort town like Dunsborough or Yallingup. And its people were not just Romans. In fact, it was the place that Romans came to holiday. And if you can imagine people going to Yallingup and digging it up in 2,000 years' time and then inferring that was how the people of Perth lived, that you can just imagine. Some people from Perth, in fact, do live in Yallingup from time to time or even frequently. But in Pompeii, the locals were Greeks, Oscans, Samnites. No doubt there were Latins too who came down on holidays or who'd migrated for the money or the sun. There were Jews, there were Syrians, there were even Egyptians. It was a town in which many different people from many different parts of the empire rubbed shoulders together. They spoke common languages. The common languages of this particular part of the world were Latin and Greek. But before Pompeii was Roman, it had been Samnite and Greek. And a matter of 180 years before Pompeii was destroyed, it had been destroyed by the Roman general Sulla as part of his social war, that is his war against Italian allies who had revolted against the power of Rome. So 180 years before one destruction was another, in which the Pompeians had been fighting against the Romans, as they had been 200 years before that. So there's no sense in which Pompeii is somehow inherently, naturally a Roman town. It's not. It's a town that was part of the Roman world. But its cultures were not simply the culture of the city of Rome. They were also the cultures of the Italian natives, the Greek colonists, and the more recent migrants to it. But what all of these people had in common, what they brought together, what enabled them to call themselves Pompeians, was their common devotion to the town and to the emperor. Otherwise, they had their own traditions and images, their own rituals and places of worship. But the emperor, and here we have an image of, this is from the Temple of Augustus. Here we have an image of Augustus himself in an act of sacrifice. The emperor and the cult of the emperor is the great socially unifying belief, ritual, and ideological proposition. I want to focus in the second part of this lecture on 4 different traditions that we find in Pompeii and what they might have meant for the life of Pompeii. Now, Roman religion was rich and diverse. And a distinguishing feature of that richness and that diversity was its tolerance and its acceptance of other deities, as long as they themselves were non-exclusive. As long as they were prepared to share heaven with Rome, Rome was prepared to share heaven with them. This was one of the strengths of the Roman state. It enabled it to co-opt local gods through the identification of their own. The Celts, and this is for those of you who've ever read Asterix the Gaul, the god that Asterix likes to invoke most frequently is Tutatis. Tutatis is a significant Celtic god whom the Romans identified with Mars, their war god. and there are shrines to Tutatis as Mars. Mars Tutatis, not in Pompeii, but elsewhere in Gaul and Britain. One of my favourite images from Roman Egypt, and I love these images, is of the god, here we have the gods Horus and Anubis. Horus here appears as a Roman centurion. Horus, of course, was the ancient Egyptian pharaoh god, the ruling god of ancient Egypt, the god incarnate in the pharaoh. The Romans here have borrowed Horus. They have turned Horus into a warrior, but not an Egyptian warrior, a Roman one, wearing the breastplate and the boots, the caligae, and the skirt there, the terigis of a Roman soldier. In the same way, Anubis here, and this is a lovely photograph from the Vatican, an image of Anubis from the Vatican Museum, has been almost entirely turned into the god Hermes, or Mercury, holding there the symbol of the god, the caduceus, and wearing a classical tunic. These Egyptian gods have become fused. Mercury and Anubis, Jupiter and Horus. Pompeii was home to a temple of the goddess Isis. Isis became an important divinity across the entire empire in Roman imperial antiquity. She came, to some thinkers and believers, to somehow embody the maternal principle in a way that was far more powerful than Roman mother goddesses like Ceres and Juno. Indeed, she combined aspects of both. She was a divine queen and she was a mother. She's the mother of Horus. She is mother and queen, mighty and fertile. In the 2nd century, the Roman novelist, and the Romans had novelists in case you didn't know, the Roman novelist Apuleius wrote a rather curious novel, one of the few to survive from antiquity, entitled The Golden Ass, or Metamorphoses. And in it, the progenitor is delivered from his worldly troubles by Isis herself, who responds to a powerful prayer. Now, there's a classical image of Isis. Egyptian Isis is normally shown with an Egyptian sistrum and a funny kind of pot with a little nipple on the bottom called a situla. And that situla has become, and in fact that's exactly what it is, it's a breast, it's a pendant breast. But here it's become a much nicer little jug. And her situla is still a situla, and in fact those little inserts they're metal inserts, and they do rattle if you want to shake the whole statue, but I wouldn't advise that. In his vision of Isis, he sees her, he writes, "All the perfumes of Arabia floated into my nostrils as the goddess deigned to address me. You see me here, Lucius," that's Lucius Apuleius, "in answer to your prayer. I am nature, the universal mother, mistress of all the elements, primordial child of time, sovereign of all things spiritual, queen of the dead, queen also of the immortals, the single manifestation of all gods and goddesses that are. Though I am worshipped in many aspects, known by countless names, and propitiated with all manner of different rites, yet the whole round earth venerates me. The primeval Phrygians call me Pessinuntica, mother of the gods. The Athenians call me Kepcropian Artemis. To the islanders of Cyprus, I am Paphian Aphrodite." You get the idea. She's not only trying to be a goddess who is truly universal, but she is, in fact, representing a universal principle which we find across the empire. Hence, it's no surprise in Pompeii that we find a temple to Isis. This was one of the first buildings, first structures to be identified when excavation of the site began in the 18th century. Frescoes and religious objects were recovered from the excavation, most notably this remarkable fresco showing the priests of Isis at work on the very steps of the temple. Significantly, the temple had been damaged in an earthquake which had struck Pompeii in AD 63. But alone of all of the temples of Pompeii was the only one to have been completely restored by the time of the volcanic eruption in August 79. And indeed, the existence of the Isis temple in Pompeii may well have inspired the composition of one of the most important historical novels about ancient Rome, Edward Bulwer-Lytton's 1834 novel, The Last Days of Pompeii. Now, the central figure and the villain of this novel is Backus, the priest of Isis. His corruption and fraudulence is resisted in the narrative by the heroic Greek and later Christian convert Glaucus. I will have a little more to say about the Christians in a few minutes, but the interesting thing about the novel is its fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the ancient religious communities of Pompeii. For Bulwer-Lytton, and I can't blame him for that, he was working in the late 18th century when we hadn't really nuanced a lot of our understandings of late Rome, or of High Roman paganism. For him, his Backus is a foreigner who is depicted importing a kind of mystical quackery into the rational and decent thought world of the Greeks and the Romans. But far from being an alien and strange place, this temple to Isis was the first temple, as I said, to be rebuilt after the 63 earthquake and was seen as a civic ornament. There is an inscription which survives, which in fact secured the identification of the temple. And I shan't trouble you with the Latin. Numerius Popidius Calcinus, son of Numerius, restored the temple of Isis from the ground up after it had been totally destroyed by an earthquake. The town council, the decuriones, that is the decuriones, the town council, co-opted him into their assembly when, and this is the remarkable thing, when he was only 6 years old, and without charge, in consideration of his generosity. What explains this? Well, I'll tell you what explains this. How does a 6-year-old do this? He doesn't. His dad does it in his name. Numerius Popidius Calcinus is the son of a freedman, a freed slave, who had been the slave of a family called Popidius. His father, that is, the father had been freed but could not aspire to municipal office. Obviously wealthy himself, he paid for all of this in the name of his son, and his son, who was born a free citizen and could aspire to municipal office, was therefore adlected into the town council. If only it was so easy to be elected to the Council of Perth. All you have to do is build a notable building, and Lisa Scafidi will pop down and say, "Join us!" No matter if you're only 6 or 7, it doesn't quite work that way here. But the real point is that this was not a strange or alien temple. This was not a temple of foreigners. This was a temple that was incorporated into the daily fabric of the city and had enormous civic importance. Another apparently foreign cult that had a place in Pompeii was that of the god Sabazius. Now, much less is known about Sabazius than about Isis. But this hand of Sabazius, sounds like the title of a science fiction novel or a horror novel, doesn't it? The Hand of Sabazius. But Sabazius the worship of Sabazius is marked by these images of hands. And we know a little bit about the god. He's a Phrygian in origin, and we can see that there's the god wearing what's called a Phrygian cap. And his worship had great... of Sabazius is this hand. And it shows the god himself, there he is, standing on the head of a ram. Presume he didn't like Aries, I don't know. With this Phrygian cap, which is surmounted with a crescent moon. Here on his thumb, floating is a pine cone. And pine cones are actually symbols of fertility. There are lots of symbols of fertility, and that's one of them. The hand is replete with more image of fertility and rebirth. But unlike the temple of Isis, the sanctuary of Sabazius was in a private house. The worship of Sabazius had been formally banned since 139 BC. It was banned in the Praetor's edict of that year and had never been revoked. But there is little serious evidence to suggest that the ban had been really enforced in the 2 centuries that had followed that time. The Romans, in fact, tended to tame the worship of Sabazius by twinning the cult of Sabazius with that of Jupiter. And so, in fact, increasingly from 1st century onwards, we find references to Jupiter Sabazius, sacrifices and dedications to Jupiter Sabazius, who becomes a soldier's god. The house associated with the hand of Sabazius is known to archaeologists as the House of Magic Rites. It's located in Region 2 of Pompeii, not far from the amphitheatre, and it's a good-sized suburban villa that must have been owned by a person of some considerable wealth. But even wealthier than the man who owned the House of Magic Rites, segue, is the owner of the Villa of the Mysteries. This large villa outside the walls of Pompeii is our richest visual source for the cult of Dionysus or Bacchus that survives from antiquity. The wall paintings in the Villa of the Mysteries, and this is one here, or rather this is a detail I should say, are exquisitely executed and provide strong narrative for the thought world of ancient Dionysiac worship. Now the cult of Dionysus, or Bacchus, I really should call him Bacchus, had been associated with the consumption of wine and a kind of holy frenzy. It was this that had led to the cult being banned from Rome at the beginning of the 2nd century BC, but by 79 it had almost become respectable. There are some especially memorable images from the house, from the Villa of the Mysteries. One of these is this image of the drunken demigod Silenus. He's holding up a bowl here for a young man to drink from. Silenus, interestingly, look at this curious garment. It is sheer purple. It's what's called Cowan silk. It's almost like wearing nothing. It was the finest, most expensive material that you could wear. And here, of course, it's dyed with purple dye, which makes it the most expensive piece of garment that anybody could have. And he's so disregarding it that he's virtually not wearing it. Just slipped down at his waist there while he feeds wine to this boy here. Here we have another youth holding what looks like a head. It's a theatrical mask. And of course the origins of the theatre back in ancient Athens are associated with the worship of Dionysus. But more to the point, that holding up of the mask, I read as a reference to Euripides' play, The Bacchae. It's a play in which King Pentheus of Thebes resists the arrival of the god Dionysus to Thebes, whereupon Dionysus' female followers leave the city, drink on Mount Kithaeron, revel, are possessed by holy frenzy, and tear apart what they think is a lion, but in fact is King Pentheus himself. And Pentheus' head is then brought on stage as a kind of gory stage prop. These frenzied women, these maenads, are part and parcel of the imagery of Bacchus Dionysus. And so here we have these maenads, or rather this frenzy being referred to in another image from the house. These we have here, these are maenads here. We know they're maenads not just because they don't have many clothes on, but because they have, this is the thesis, the symbol of the god, and they seem to be whirling and dancing and otherwise perhaps having a bit of a rest here, in holy frenzy. These symbols of the cult of Roman Bacchus, the god Dionysus, like the cult of Isis, are not about the import of a foreign god, but about the way in which the people of Pompeii expressed their religious devotion. Why wine? Is it just because it was fun? Well, no. It's not just because it's fun, it's because viticulture was an important industry in the town. The slopes of Vesuvius supported vineyards, and many of the rural villas around the town supported themselves by their own production of wine. I likened Pompeii before to Dunsborough or Yallingup. This is doubly so because the country in which Pompeii was situated was wine country. And the wine industry was as important to the people of Pompeii as it is now to the people of Margaret River or Dunsborough or Yallingup or, where I live, the Swan Valley. Their devotion to Dionysus, to Bacchus, is a feature of this. And although there is no official priesthood of the god in the town, shrines and images of Dionysus and of his product are common throughout the town and its surrounds. Now, these cults were, in a sense, all different aspects of the same thing. Now, the Christian community of Pompeii featured in Bill Leadbetter's novel, The Last Days of Pompeii. It was the Christian Olynthus, whom Backus, the wicked priest of Isis, takes as an enemy and frames him for murder. But it is Olynthus who also in the novel becomes the agent of redemption, converting the Greek Glaucus to Christianity. When Bill Leadbetter wrote the novel, there was no evidence to suggest that there was a Christian community in Pompeii. Reason or romance might find one necessary, but it was not till the discovery of a curious graffito at the house of Paquius Proculus that the existence of such a community was confirmed. And curiously, we have a portrait of Paquius Proculus and Mrs. Proculus. So there we are, there's the householder and his wife. It's unlikely that they are actually the Christians, but we have in their house a remarkable little kind of surreptitious word puzzle scratched on the south wall of the courtyard, the peristyle of the house. This text reads, and you can almost make it out, Rotes arepo, tenet, opera, it's the other way around. Rotes opera arepo, tenet arepo sator. Rotes opera tenet arepo sator. Now, the translated sentence is less important than the fact that constructed in a word square, the word tenet appears in the form of a cross. And if you go do a bit more jiggery pokery with this, as kind of acrostic and anagram people like to do, you will find that it also provides a wonderful anagram of Pater Noster, our Father, in the form of a cross with the N as an axial letter. And when this is done, the two letters that are omitted are A and O, the Alpha and the Omega of Scripture. The existence of this acrostic is a clear sign of the presence of Christians in Pompeii. In this case, members of the Paquius household, perhaps even slaves of the Paquius household. Another of these was also found in a column, scratched into a column on the exercise ground near the amphitheatre, what's called the Great Palaestra. Now, this was a reasonably public place, but this word puzzle might have served as a clandestine symbol around which Christians might gather innocently enough. The Christian community had been outlawed by Nero, and there is not only no evidence of the relaxation of that ban into a kind of passive tolerance that we find for many banned pagan cults, there is active evidence of the continuation of persecution, certainly in the letters of Pliny towards the end of the 1st century. Pliny refers to the outlawed nature of Christianity and the job of the provincial governor to prosecute Christians. So unlike Sabazius and unlike Backus, the God of the Christians remained on the banned list. The Christians did not enjoy a kind of bemused and easy tolerance, but it was recognised that they were outside the community. It was well understood that Christianity was an exclusive religion, that those who became Christians cut themselves off from the social and religious mainstream, that their stubborn refusal to take part in the imperial cult marked them as disloyal to the emperor and the empire, and their steadfast failure to acknowledge the existence of any god but their own marked them out to many as simply weirdos. So Christian communities remained for many decades clandestine and ambiguous, relying on such symbols as the word square or other equally ambiguous images like the shepherd or the dove or the anchor. It might be argued that all religion is a struggle against mortality. Certainly death and the cult of the dead featured heavily in the religious life of ancient Pompeii. The walls of the city of Pompeii enclosed the city of the living. Along the roads outside the city, leading from the gates, were the tombs of the deceased. This was the great city of the dead, situated alongside but not within the community. The dead did not live within the community. There were no cemeteries within the walls of Pompeii. This was one of the other things that marked Christians out. They liked to keep the bodies of their dead with them in their houses of worship, if possible. Classical paganism, classical non-Christian religion, liked to put the dead outside the city, outside the walls, because you couldn't quite trust the dead. I mean, they might be okay if they were family and all that, but it was better to have them outside the walls than inside the walls so that you could go and visit them. You certainly didn't want them to come to visit you. So, that's what they did. The roads into the town were lined with the tombs of the dead, the great family tombs. The more elaborate the tomb, the wealthier the family. Every year on significant anniversaries and during the festival of Parentalia, the living came outside the walls of the city to feast with their ancestors. Families picnicked at these tombs, leaving incense and flowers and giving gifts of wine and oil. Some tombs were even equipped with handy little funnels so that the offerings of wine and oil could be poured directly into the funeral urns of the deceased. These acts of devotion were woven into the daily fabric of life in Pompeii, much like the offerings to the lares in the household. A man would come in, a woman would come in from the street, more often the man because the women didn't go out that much. A man would come in from the street and just offer a pinch of incense to the lara of the house on his safe arrival to give thanks that he was back home. Just normal, natural thing to do. But it would be a mistake to consider these rituals and ceremonies as simply that. Any ritual is an attempt to understand the universe and respond to it. These rituals, these daily rituals, were not superstitions, just as the Pompeians themselves, with their complex and multifaceted religious belief, should not be thought of as somehow as primitive simpletons, as people often characterise ancient religion. Because the ultimate point that marks all of this is sincerity. These people believed these things and constructed their lives and their daily realities around them. They constructed the certainties of life upon their foundation. We are fortunate that through the anger of geology, so much of their daily life has been preserved for us. Moreover, we have only really begun to learn about Roman religion. For a long time, we have been imprisoned by our own natural cynicism and the scepticism of some classical writers. But Pompeii, the streets of Pompeii, the houses of Pompeii, the temples of Pompeii, the walls of Pompeii, the images of Pompeii, the objects of Pompeii, bring us into contact with the everyday religious lifeway and experience of ordinary people from all walks of life: slave, free, rich, poor, powerful, powerless, Greek, Roman, Oscan, Egyptian. This evening, as we have looked at their religious lives, and believe me, I have only skated across the surface, we have encountered them at their most honest and sincere, even their most complex. And I wonder what people who will look at us in 2,000 years' time will say. Thank you.